a political ploy to put a lot of pressure on the next chair of the Federal Reserve. But Senator
I think we've got a problem with that connection with Michael Data of Roth Capital. Is he out in a chalet somewhere, skiing?
for
We're going to try and re-establish that.
So.
Look, the noise on the Federal Reserve, and hopefully we can reconnect with Mike and we'll continue the conversation. We've talked about this a few times. The perception, and perception is important. The members of the committee right now, and we've seen that evidently from the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell himself, perceive there to be a threat from the White House that is a threat to their independence. And we've talked about that galvanizing the other officials on the Federal Reserve, which makes it difficult for whoever comes in to lead the committee and get everyone else to follow them. It's going to be very hard for the next Fed chair.
It potentially can be very hard to gain that consensus, unless maybe it's someone from within, like Governor Waller. But his name hasn't been thrown out as much as some of the others, Jonathan.
I understand we've reconnected with Mike Dowder of Roth Capital. So, Mike, we can continue the conversation. Let's go with it. Okay, I understand why this Fed could be a more unruly Federal Reserve. Does the market price the volatility within the Federal Reserve, or does the market price the outcome of that volatility, which means it's difficult to reduce interest rates?
Yeah, I mean, look, the market still gives the Fed a lot of credibility and is not looking for a huge political disruption. So, I think we're playing with fire here going down this path with a lot of political pressure on the Federal Reserve. So we'll see what happens. I mean, at least there's some pushback. Senator Tillis has basically defended Powell, saying forget any new appointees to the FOMC until this is resolved. And you have a divided Fed, and this is a Federal Reserve that makes decisions based on a consensus. So you don't just pick one member to lead the Fed and then assume that rates are going to go to 1 because you assume that's a good idea. So we'll see how all of this plays out, but I think the administration's really overplayed their hand here.
I'm glad you mentioned Senator Tom Tillis. He spoke with Jonathan, Lisa, and myself in Davos, and he talked about the fact that he is not going to let a candidate go through until this is resolved in terms of the DOJ probe on Jay Powell, or the more than 340 days he has left until his retirement. Do you think the market is pricing in the fact that we can have Jay Powell be the Fed chair for, I don't know, another 300 days?
Well, I mean, look, his board seat doesn't expire until 2028. So if Fed Chair Powell is really worried about political influence on the Fed, he could stay on as a voter and deny the administration that board seat. So, they would have to use the expiring term of Governor Marin for the next Fed chair. And then, as I said in the quote, you've got a pretty divided and defiant FOMC. So that's just kind of a mess. But it also prevents dramatic political manipulation of the Fed and pushing the Fed down a path where it's doing things it shouldn't be doing. Running it hot might sound very good in the short term, but let's not forget how the 10-year went from 50 basis points to 5%. That occurred on the back of an inflationary policy error by the Federal Reserve. So I don't think we want to repeat that exercise again.
Mike, do you believe there is upside inflation risk this year? And what's the source of that?
No, not really. I mean, I think that the Powell Fed has done a phenomenal job here in terms of the previous tightening and then easing by just about the right amount. The nominal economy has been super steady. Inflation expectations are anchored. So I think that they've presided over just almost a perfect, immaculate disinflation. And I think that continues this year. But we're playing with fire in terms of what the administration is doing, and they should really reverse course, in my opinion.
Mike, it's good to see you. My apologies about the technical disruption. Mike Dowder there of Roth Capital on the Federal Reserve. This from Torsten Slock of Apollo in the past few weeks. Covered it on the program. I think worth repeating. The risk of overheating here. The list of tailwinds keeps growing. We're starting to worry about overheating in 26. Torsten Slock of Apollo just a few weeks back.
And he had so many reasons on that list, including the AI trade, the build out of those data centers. On top of that, we are in 2026. This is the year the United States will be hosting the World Cup. The tourism that's going to be coming in, the money that is going to be spent on that. He had so many reasons why potentially we could be overheating this year. And you have to think, potentially is that a concern for inflation?
I was so excited about the World Cup coming to this country this year. Just thought right time, right place.
Ticket prices.
Return of Americana, great moment for the sport in this country as well. The scenes we've seen play out, the headlines we've witnessed in the past week or so, out of just one state. I just wonder how much perception is being shaped by that abroad. and how few people decide to actually come over and watch the games. Now, I hope in 6 months' time, we're all wrong about this. I hope the stadiums are full. I'll be one of the happier people sitting around this table to see that play out. I hope that's the case.
I hope so too. I mean, right now, when you have the State Department talking about visa bans for a number of countries, especially a country like Brazil, but saying, oh, but it won't affect the World Cup. But if you're an individual, are you looking at what's playing out in America and thinking, I feel safe to go there right now from these countries? No.
Futures right now, negative by close to 0.2% on the S&P. Up next, we'll catch up with Sarah Hunt of Alpine Saxon Woods, Terry Haynes of Pangea Policy, Stephen Shawk of the Shawk Group, and Bob Michael of JP Morgan Asset Management. The second hour of Bloomberg Surveillance, up next.
Welcome to the next generation of website creation.
The U.S. economy is really growing fast.
The U.S. has been really an incredibly strongly performing market, strong economy.
Corporate health is excellent. Consumer health at the top end is excellent. Diversifying away from America is impossible.
So if you look at the economy today, there's a lot of good short-term things.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Farrow, Lisa Abramowitz, and
This equity futures a touch softer. We're down by about 0.1% on the S&P 500. On the Nasdaq, we're down by 2%. $5K for the first time ever. Lots of reasons for that. We'll get into it in just a moment. Going into this massive week ahead, lots of earnings. We'll get that Wednesday and Thursday from big tech, Microsoft, Meta, Apple. A Fed rate decision coming up on Wednesday, and an address from the President of the United States tomorrow.
There's a ton, and potentially a government shutdown, Jonathan, by the end of the week, given what we heard from Senator Schumer over the weekend. When it comes to the Federal Reserve, there's no urgency either way. That's made obvious by Fed officials. What is going to be interesting, though, is a lot of developments have happened since we last heard from Jay Powell. And the Q&A at the press conference is going to be very insightful. One, do you think it was political that you showed up to Lisa Cook's hearing at the Supreme Court? 2, what can you tell us about the DOJ probe? 3, do you plan to stay on past your chairmanship, to stay on as governorship? And I don't know if the chairman is going to offer any insight into how he's thinking about a number of these issues that are political, not monetary policy focused.
Base case would be he won't engage.
Yeah.
I would say I've lost some conviction around that base case, given how assertive he was just a few weeks back. That was a different Chairman Powell. And I wonder how willing he is to address some of those questions in the news conference this Wednesday.
Yeah, he might come out a little bit more forthright in how he's thinking, especially since the fact that he has showed up to Lisa Cook's hearing. And you heard from the Treasury Secretary saying that is Jay Powell that is politicizing the situation. He might talk about whether or not he's had phone conversations with members on the Hill, like Senator Tom Tillis, who says that he is not going to entertain the administration's next candidate until what is going on with the DOJ is basically figured out between Jay Powell. It's going to be an interesting next few weeks.
It's interesting looking at the market betting, the probability, all those things out there at the moment who are now got Rick Reeder in the lead, because they think that the other individuals are a little bit too studio to talk about the Federal Reserve here at Bloomberg Surveillance, getting through that winter storm just to talk about the Federal Reserve. Let's talk about this storm. Here on Wall Street, we're starting to put some numbers on it. This came from Bank of America and Aditya Bharve. The impact of Fern may drag down Q1 GDP by 0.5 to 1.5% quarter on quarter.
It's no surprise when you find out that this is the most flight cancellation since COVID, when the world literally stopped and there was bans on flights. Individuals cannot get to the airport. If you can get to the airport, it's too icy. The conditions are not safe for flights to take off. So we saw more than 11,000 flight cancellations over this weekend, and the number is going up this morning as of 1:30 a.m. 3,500 flights were canceled. And if you're an individual that potentially works in the city, besides us, I think you're working from home.
It's pretty quiet. Let's put it that way in Manhattan, but it's always pretty quiet around 4 a.m. anyway. But I imagine it's going to be pretty quiet throughout the day ahead. We'll keep tracking developments for you through the hour right here on Bloomberg TV. Coming up this hour, we'll also catch up with Sarah Hunt of Alpine Saxon Woods as equities look to bounce back. Stephen Schork of the Schork Group as U.S. natural gas prices soar. And Bob And looking at, if I dare say, an equity haven trade at the moment seems to be small caps. The outperformance of small over large so far this year is notable. We've got the S&P up by around 1% and smalls up by close to 8% on the Russell 2000, Sarah. And I just wonder if some of these themes, forces that we're discussing right now, policy risk out of the White House, speak to the fact that some people are just looking elsewhere to smaller companies that might not be in the firing line.
I think that there's also been, we've been talking about, or investors have been talking about a catch-up trade in small caps for a long time. And I think that the concern that happened with the small caps when they started to rally a couple of years ago was really much more concerned about a U.S. recession and how that was going to impact small caps. I think that I wouldn't say that it's 100% taken off the table, because you can never say 100%, but I would say that the idea that we were running into a recession is less of a problem right now. That's beneficial to small caps. People are looking for value because they've seen how much the multiples are higher in the larger cap spaces. So I think that there is a combination of things that are going on there. One, better feelings about the U.S. economy, better feelings about what's going to happen in earnings in general, and a valuation gap that has been fairly substantial. So I think that people are looking for value in markets. They always do. And this is some place where they're starting to find it right now.
Well, Sarah, let's pick up on point one. I think it's the most important point. The re-rating of the outlook for U.S. growth. And it's been re-rated quite dramatically. When I look at notes from Torsten Slok of Apollo talking about overheating, and I'll have a similar conversation with Morgan Stanley a little bit later this morning. Sarah, that is a well-understood story now. How well priced is that story in equities?
Well, there's a give and take with that, right? Because if the economic picture is that much better, then it sort of poses the question of why we need to be cutting rates, where the technology sector is still looking, well, the market is still looking for a couple of rate cuts this year. I think that there's going to be some tension there, because yes, I actually do see that the economic picture looks pretty good. And so that begs the question of why we need to cut rates, which gets into the whole problem that the White House is having with the Federal Reserve. So there's a lot of different tensions there, but I do think that the U.S. looks pretty good relative, especially to the rest of the world, but also just relative in general to the last couple of years. You have some things that have gotten a little bit out of the way, and you do see some reasonable employment. You see some good numbers on the economic front, and I think that that's just going to help equities in the U.S. perform better.
Sarah, you don't sound like someone who's part of the Sell America trade. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's accurate.
So you're saying sticking with the United States, especially when it comes to the economic backdrop. When it comes to your last point just about the Federal Reserve, basically, do you now, when you look at some of these economic projections, do you now basically map in no rate cuts from this Fed?
Well, I think that the expectation on rate cuts and the reality of rate cuts is not really matched up very well in the last couple of years, because if you start out every year, I mean, we're not starting out this year this way, but if you started out every year in the last couple of years expecting some major number of rate cuts, and we haven't actually gotten them because the economic data has been pretty decent. And I think that that's
You, just you, building your app on base 44. Describe it.
I think that's going to be the big story of 2026, on top of another couple of things. If we don't see inflation, you can say, okay, if you needed to get some rate relief, you could have it. But if you see very strong growth, it's going to be harder to justify that. And I don't see how all of this noise around the Fed helps that in any way, shape, or form, because no matter what happens, it's going to be discussed as politicized. But I think in the end, the U.S. economy is doing pretty well. And it's hard to see how that is majorly impacted in the near term, in the same way that you've got some of the issues with other kinds of slowdowns in Europe and other places. So I think that the U.S. is looking pretty good right now. And I think that the consumer is looking and acting pretty good right now. So we'll see how that plays out as we get through the year. And we do have to be concerned about inflation popping back up, because power prices are higher. And even though you don't have as many inflation drivers as you had before, there are still some in the system. So I think that that's another reason where cutting rates might be a little bit difficult to justify.
We'll discuss those power prices later this hour with Stephen Short. Looking forward to that. Sarah, good to see you. Sarah Hunt there of Alpine Saxon Woods. If you're just joining us, welcome to the program. Futures were negative by a few tenths of 1% on the S&P, now just about unchanged, almost completely flat on the S&P 500. Let's give you an update on stories elsewhere this morning. Here is your Bloomberg brief. The US East Coast trying to get back to normal after yesterday's massive snowstorm, the storm causing the most flight cancellations since the COVID-19 pandemic, according to FlightAware. More than 3,600 flights were cancelled as of this morning. Elsewhere, OPEC Plus sticking with the supply pause. Delegates telling us here at Bloomberg the group is currently expected to maintain all production levels when they meet on Sunday. There are no signs it needs to adjust supply due to events in Venezuela and Iran. And finally, BYD aiming to increase overseas deliveries by nearly 25% this year, targeting 1.3 million sales outside of China. Strong demand abroad helping BYD overtake Tesla in 2025 to become the world's largest EV maker. How many of those cars will be sold in Canada alone over the next few years?
That's what I was thinking, obviously, because this is at the crux, really, of this concern between Ottawa and Washington right now. And we've seen what BYD has been doing to Europe. Going in there, massive investment, and it's, as you say, it's overtaking Tesla.
Commerce Secretary didn't hold back last week in Davos, Switzerland. It's going to complicate negotiations over USMCA later this year.
USMCA, those negotiations are going to be incredibly challenging, especially when the President of the United States is now calling the Prime Minister of Canada, Governor Carney, like he did with Justin Trudeau.
It didn't help last time, did it?
Nope.
See if it helps this time. Up next on the program, tensions rising across the aisle.
Maybe go to another city and let the people of Minneapolis decide.
We don't stop this in its tracks. People being killed simply for exercising their First Amendment rights is going to be a regular feature in this country. That should unite Republicans and Democrats in Congress.
That conversation up next with Terry Haynes of Pangea Policy, live from New York City this morning. Good morning. 2 days away from a Federal Reserve decision here stateside. Equities into that just about unchanged on the S&P 500, slightly lower to a very, very volatile trading week last week. The Nasdaq 100 down by 0.1%. The Russell down by 0.1% also. Under surveillance this morning, tensions rising across the aisle.
If the mayor and the governor are going to put our ICE officials in harm's way, and there's a chance of losing more, innocent lives or whatever, then maybe go to another city and let the people of Minneapolis decide.
We don't stop this in its tracks. What you were seeing in Minnesota, people being killed simply for exercising their First Amendment rights, is going to be a regular feature in this country. That should unite Republicans and Democrats in Congress.
So here's the latest this morning. Senate Democrats vowing to oppose a government spending bill unless funding for the Department of Homeland Security is split off. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall joins us now for more. Good morning, Tyler.
Hey, John, good morning. Well, a senior aide to Democratic leadership tells me that Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer says that he has the votes to potentially block this spending package, which could risk a partial government shutdown this Friday, which is the deadline for the full appropriations process to ultimately play out. If we look at the math here, Republicans need 7 Democrats to get on board with the spending package as it stands. And we've already started to see some of those Democrats that supported Republicans last time around start to peel off when it comes to their support. If we take a step back, the Senate is right now considering 6 spending bills that would fund the government for the rest of the fiscal year. One of those in part funds the Department of Homeland Security, and Democrats now want to see some of that funding stripped out. The issue with that, though, is that any changes to the broader spending package would have to get kicked back down to the House and the crowd of Washington until February 2nd, which means that they would have to come back in early, and we're already starting to see some issues and delays on Capitol Hill related to the weather. There are also big questions here about whether or not this could reverse some key and hard-fought wins for Democrats in the spending package as it stands. They were able to reverse some of the Trump administration spending cuts to foreign aid, for example. Plus, we have to keep in mind Immigration and Customs Enforcement received a
once a year I do a program that's for free. I started during COVID, and as they're shut
under the one big beautiful bill. So others are raising concerns that this is actually going to impact other agencies under DHS and not ICE, such as FEMA, as just one key example here. So there's going to be a lot of negotiation as this goes forward, and we'll have to see what ends up happening, John. It is our understanding that Senate Republicans have reached out to Democrats as we're starting to see some growing unease among the GOP when it does come to President Trump's immigration crackdown, but they're really more calling for investigations investigations to happen rather than impacting any of the funding that's currently under consideration on Capitol Hill.
Tyler Kendall down in Washington. Tyler, thank you. To build on some of that, Terry Haynes of Pangea Policy joins us now for more. Terry, I'm going to kick it off by asking for a projection, a forecast, the call. Where are we going to be by the time we get to midterms at year end?
By the time we get to midterms, I think this will be an important aspect of things. I think what you end up with today is I think you end up with a continued Republican Senate. The map is just not very good for Democrats. And also, I think anybody that tells you, as I've heard on your air in the past, that the Democrats are projected to pick up this many seats or that many seats, I think is way, way over their skis. You have a situation where there's about 10% of the seats that are open right now. We don't even know who the challengers are in a lot of those seats, and yet people are already projecting Democratic gains or Republican holds. I think what you got is a situation here at the bottom line is where you have a very small Republican majority in the Senate, and whether or not there is a Democratic majority, it's going to be tiny. And a lot of that depends, a lot of a Democrat's pitch depends on how electable their candidates are. If they end up with a lot of Jasmine Crockett-like candidates in the House, their odds go down substantially.
Terry, there was a shocking incident when it comes to the deadly shooting in Minnesota this weekend. How do you see Congress pushing back against some of the rhetoric we saw in the White House over the next 24 hours or even the next week?
Well, I got to say two things, but one, both institutional, one directly on Congress. Look, nobody, John Kennedy used to joke, President Kennedy used to joke that his Pulitzer Prize winning book, Profiles in Courage, was a very short book for a reason. And that book was about congressional bravery. What you got here is, Congress is lazy. And that may sound uncharitable to people who are running around like crazy, dealing with their constituencies and their jobs. But Congress is not doing